She vanished 3 years ago without a word. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. Now she's back, standing in a Jeju luxury mall with a child who has his eyes, his jaw, his stillness. But she isn't crying. She isn't trembling. She isn't reaching for him. She's watching him the way someone watches a door they've been waiting to open. And that is what terrifies him most. This isn't a love story. This is a reckoning. Inheritance of salt, where blood is leverage, silence is strategy, and the most dangerous person in the room is the one you thought you knew. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment, because this story will not wait for you. The baby reached for a display case of ceremonial pottery, and that was what made Siwoo look. Not the child's face, not yet. Just the small, deliberate hand, utterly fearless, pressing a palm against glass that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Siwoo noticed the gesture because it reminded him of something, a quality he recognized in himself, that particular brand of boldness that didn't perform itself, didn't announce itself, simply acted as though the world had already agreed to accommodate it. Then the child turned, and Siwoo's chest stopped working. The boy was perhaps 2.5, maybe 3. He had a serious face, not sullen, but composed in the way that certain children are composed, as though they arrived in the world already carrying an opinion about it. His eyes were gray-blue, a color that had no business existing on a Korean child unless that child had a specific genetic inheritance. Siwoo knew that color intimately. He had seen it every morning of his adult life in every mirror he had ever stood before. Beside the boy stood Zoe. She was not looking at the pottery. She was not looking at the child. She was looking directly at Siwoo across 40 feet of marble atrium and ambient mall noise, and the particular unreality of a Tuesday afternoon in Jeju, and her expression contained nothing that he had expected to find there. No shock. No guilt. No the sudden dilation of someone caught mid-escape. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a bus, and the bus had finally arrived, and now the only question was whether to board it or let it pass. Siwoo became aware of Haein speaking beside him. She was discussing the photo arrangement for the announcement, whether they should use the rooftop terrace of the Shilla or opt for something more intimate, something that photographed warmer. Her voice was precise and considered, the way all of Haein's communication was precise and considered, because Haein understood that public moments were not moments at all but compositions, and compositions required editorial control. He heard none of it. Siwoo. Haein's hand touched his forearm, light, professional, the touch of a woman who understood the difference between affection and signaling. "You've gone somewhere. Give me a moment," he said. He crossed the atrium. Zoe did not run. She did not move toward him either. She simply waited, one hand resting loosely on the child's shoulder, and when Siwoo stopped 3 feet in front of her, the boy looked up at him with those impossible eyes and said nothing, only studied him with the gravity of a small scientist encountering an unfamiliar variable. "Zoe." His voice came out steadier than he deserved credit for. "Siwoo." Hers came out exactly as she intended, which meant it gave him nothing. He looked at the child. The child looked back. Siwoo felt something move through him that had no name in any language he spoke. Not love exactly, not recognition exactly, but something older than both, something cellular and irrefutable, the body knowing what the mind was still refusing to process. "How old?" he asked. 3 in April. He did the math in the space of a single breath. She had left in March, 3 years ago. She had been pregnant when she left and had not told him and had vanished into a silence so complete that his investigators, and he had deployed investigators, quietly, carefully, because he was not a man who accepted disappearances, had returned with nothing useful for 8 months. By the time they found a trace of her, a lease agreement in Busan under a name that was almost hers, but not quite, there was no one left at the address. She had moved again. He had told himself a story about it. Most people do, when they cannot find the truth. The story he had told himself was not flattering to either of them, but it was the story that allowed him to continue functioning, which is usually the only criterion a necessary story needs to meet. The story had apparently been wrong. "We don't have time for nostalgia," Zoe said. He blinked. I'm sorry. Whatever conversation you're preparing to have, the one with recriminations in it, and questions about 3 years, and possibly some version of how could you save it. She glanced past his shoulder briefly, a movement so controlled it barely qualified as a glance. We're being watched, and I don't mean by your fiancé. Explain that. Not here. She crouched suddenly, smoothly, and said something to the child in a low voice. The boy nodded, that same grave nod, and took her hand without complaint. She straightened. Dal, this is, she paused, and in that pause was 3 years of calculated decision. This is someone I know. Dal looked at Siwoo. Hello, he said, in a voice that was small but carried no shyness. Hello, Siwoo said, and the word felt like the most consequential thing he had ever said. Then Zoe's phone vibrated. She glanced at it, and something shifted in her face, not fear, but acceleration, the way a pilot's face shifts when they've decided to pull up. I have to go, she said. Zoe. Latte Mall. The cafe on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. Tomorrow. 9 in the morning. She was already moving, Dal walking perfectly in step beside her, and Siwoo noticed, even then, even in the storm of that moment, that the child walked the way she walked, with that same deliberate economy of movement, as though he had already decided where he was going before his feet began to move. A sound from the floor above. Sharp, brief, the particular disruption of a security response, footsteps moving too fast to be casual, voices in the registers of controlled urgency. By the time Siwoo turned back, they were gone. He stood in the middle of the atrium of a luxury mall on Jeju Island, his engagement announcement 48 hours away, and felt the entire architecture of the last 3 years shift beneath him like an island discovering it was standing on a fault line. Haein appeared at his side. She did not ask who that was. She had seen everything, had processed it with the same clean efficiency she brought to political risk assessments, and now she was waiting for him to tell her how they were going to handle it. That was her, he said. I assumed. A pause. The child. Yes. I see. Haein said nothing further for a moment. Then, you're going to need to find out what she wants before you decide what you want. You understand that. He did understand it. That was the problem. He understood it completely, and still found that understanding insufficient for what he was actually feeling, which was something that all his years of system-minded discipline had not quite managed to excise from his nervous system. He had thought he was past her. He had done the work, not emotional work. He was not particularly built for emotional work in the way people meant when they used that phrase, but the structural work, the work of removing her from his operational life, his succession planning, his assumptions about the future. He had, in the language of his world, written her out. She had come back and written herself in again. And she had not come back afraid. She had not come back apologetic. She had come back the way someone comes back when they have finished preparing, when the preparation has reached the point of adequacy, when the timing has aligned with the intention. She had come back with his son and the demeanor of someone executing a plan. He needed to know what the plan was. He spent the rest of that day making inquiries he did not announce to anyone, through channels he had maintained precisely because they were not connected to anything Jun-suk touched. The results began arriving by evening, and each result was a small detonation. Zoe had been on Jeju for 31 days. She had entered under a passport that was not fraudulent. She had dual nationality she had never mentioned to him, using a surname that was her maternal grandmother's. The property she was leasing was registered to a consulting company incorporated in Singapore 18 months ago. The company had a real website and real clients, and had apparently been operational long enough to develop a credible paper presence. She had private security training. Not amateur preparation, actual training. The kind that took months, required connections, and left specific kinds of physical markers that his contact in the forensic field had described with the uncomfortable admiration professionals feel when they encounter other professionals. She had been meeting someone inside his organization. That last piece arrived late, and it arrived without a name, only a pattern, access points, timing, a series of digital interactions that his investigator mapped like a cartographer mapping a river system, tracing channels and tributaries without yet knowing the source. But the pattern was there. Someone inside. Regular contact. Deliberate encryption. Siwoo sat with that information in his study in the Jeju villa, the one that overlooked the ocean with the kind of view that was supposed to produce clarity, and found instead that every answer had a room behind it that contained more questions. Zoe had not run from him. He had believed, for 3 years, that she had run from him, from the weight of what he was, from the world he operated in, from the particular loneliness of loving someone who managed systems rather than emotions. People did run from those things. It was reasonable to run from those things. He had not blamed her for it, or not entirely, or not out loud. But she had not run. She had left in a specific direction, with a specific purpose, and had maintained that purpose for 3 years while raising their son alone in what appeared to be a state of continuous strategic preparation. The question that kept returning, that he turned over and examined from each angle the way his mind turned over organizational problems, was not the one he had expected to find most urgent. It was not, why didn't she tell me about the child? It was, what did she find out that made leaving feel like the only safe move? He arrived at the cafe on the 3rd floor at 8:47. Not because he was anxious, or not only because of that, but because arriving first was a fundamental habit, a way of controlling the ground of any encounter. He took a table with sightlines to both entrances and ordered black coffee and waited. She arrived at 9 exactly. Dal was not with her. Where is he? Siwoo asked, before she had sat down. Safe. She settled into the chair across from him with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this in her mind enough times that the physical reality of it no longer had the power to destabilize her. With someone I trust. I want to know who you trust. I know you do. She looked at him steadily. That's not the first thing we're going to talk about. Then what is? Jun-suk. The name landed between them like something dropped from a height. Siwoo set down his coffee cup. He kept his face arranged in the particular configuration of neutrality that had served him through 20-odd years of conversations that could not afford to show their contents on the surface. What about him, he said. Zoe leaned forward slightly. Not for intimacy, for precision. How much do you actually know about what he's been doing with the Honam distribution channels in the last 4 years? Siwoo said nothing. I'll tell you what I know, she said. And then you can tell me where the gaps are. She began to talk. She talked for 45 minutes, and Siwoo did not interrupt her once. What she laid out was not a theory. It was documentation, specifics she had gathered over 3 years, from sources she had cultivated with impatience that he found, even in the midst of being gutted by the content of what she was describing, professionally extraordinary. Names. Dates. Financial flows. The shell companies nested inside other shell companies. The point where those financial flows intersected with operations he had always understood to be below the operational floor of his organization. The things he did not do, had made explicitly clear he did not do, had built the structure of his rules around not doing. The trafficking intermediaries were real. The connection was documented. And the connection ran through Jun-suk's decisions, not through his. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the timeline. The timeline showed that a mid-level executive named Park had known, and Park had briefed Jun-suk. And Jun-suk had chosen to maintain the revenue stream rather than excise it, because the revenue stream was feeding a faction inside the organization that was, quietly and methodically, becoming more powerful than the nominal leader. Becoming more powerful than Siwoo. When did you find this out? He asked. His voice was even. Professionally even, the kind of even that took effort. Before I left. She held his gaze. I confronted Park directly. I shouldn't have, I didn't know yet what I was dealing with. He didn't threaten me explicitly, but I understood what he was telling me. That if you told me. That by the time it reached you, the version of events that arrived would not be the version I sent. She paused. They would have made it look like I was the problem. That I had found out about the organization's operations and was preparing to use them against you, against the syndicate. I was pregnant. I had no institutional standing. I had nothing except what I knew, which they also knew, which made me a liability. So you ran. I positioned. The word was deliberate, slightly sharp. There's a difference. He looked at her across the table and felt something rearrange inside him. Not forgiveness, not yet. That was too simple a word for what was happening, but the collapse of a story he had been telling himself. replaced by a story that was harder in some ways, and in other ways an enormous relief. Because it meant she had not left because of what he was. She had left because of what she had discovered, and because she had been smart enough, strategic enough, to recognize that returning without preparation would only create a target. "You've been building a case," he said. "I've been building several things simultaneously." A pause. "I built a life for Dal that doesn't depend on you. I built legal protection that sits outside your organizational reach or Jun-suk's. I built evidence that is held by people who have instructions to release it to 3 separate journalists if I don't check in on a specific schedule." She said all of this without heat, without performance. It was information delivery. It was also, he understood, a clear message. Do not make the mistake of thinking you hold the leverage here. And you came back now because the evidence is complete. And because Jun-suk is moving faster than I anticipated. She picked up her coffee, drank, set it down. He's going to make a play for formal control within 6 months. Possibly less. When he does, the trafficking connections will become a liability for him too, but he'll manage that by sacrificing the people beneath him and emerging clean. Unless someone moves first. "Someone," Siwoo said. "You," she said. "It has to be you." External exposure without internal support creates a media disaster and a legal one. You moving to dismantle it yourself, before it's exposed, is the only move that preserves anything worth preserving. You've thought about this for 3 years. I've done nothing but think about this for 3 years. Something flickered across her face then, not quite emotion, more the negative space where emotion had been and had been managed into something more functional. While raising your son alone. While not knowing whether you were complicit or oblivious. While trying to plan for every possible version of what this conversation might be. There it was. The thing beneath the strategy. He sat with it. He did not try to rush past it or smooth it over with an apology that would land like a formality. "Which version did you decide was more likely?" he asked. "Complicit or oblivious?" "Oblivious," she said, after a pause that was honest rather than calculated. "You're not cruel. You're negligent in specific ways that amount to the same damage sometimes. But you're not Jun-suk. That's a very restrained thing to say to someone you've been investigating for 3 years. I'm a restrained person. You weren't always." Something in the quality of silence changed. She looked at him, really looked at him, the first time in the conversation that her gaze contained something other than mission parameters, and said, "No, I wasn't always." And then she picked up her coffee again and the professional distance reasserted itself, and Siwoo understood that this was the line, the precise line, where the personal ended and the operational continued. And that crossing it today was not available to either of them. He asked her what she needed from him to proceed. She told him. The list was specific, demanding, and structured in a way that showed she had been thinking architecturally. She wasn't asking for gestures, she was asking for system changes. Access to financial records at a level that would confirm her documentation. A meeting with Haein, which surprised him enough that he asked her to repeat it. And time, not love, not reunion, not the reconstruction of what they had been, but time for Dal to begin developing a relationship with his father that was not contingent on outcomes. "He deserves to know you," she said. "Whatever happens with everything else, he deserves that. But I won't use him as a bridge. He's not infrastructure." "I know," Siwoo said. "Do you?" It was a genuine question, without cruelty in it, which made it harder to answer than a cruel question would have been. "I'm learning," he said, and that was the most honest thing he had said in years. She nodded once, and then she left. The meeting with Haein happened 3 days later, in a private room at a restaurant near the harbor that all 3 of them had reason to visit without it appearing significant. Siwoo had told Haein what he knew, which by that point was substantial, and Haein had processed it with the particular efficiency that made her both an excellent political ally and occasionally a mildly alarming human being to be in proximity to. Zoe arrived and did not extend pleasantries, and Haein did not extend them either, and Siwoo sat between them and thought that this was probably one of the more unusual arrangements he had ever navigated. "I expected you to be angrier," Zoe said to Haein. "Why?" Haein asked, genuinely curious. "The child. The history. The Zoe gestured vaguely at the situation. I agreed to this engagement for strategic reasons, Heian said calmly. Siwoo and I have never been confused about what those reasons were. The existence of a child from before our arrangement is personally irrelevant to me. The existence of an internal power threat to the organization is very relevant. She looked at Zoe with the steady assessment of a woman who evaluates everything. You're more capable than I expected. That's a generous thing to say. It's an accurate thing to say. I don't do generous. She looked down at the documents Zoe had provided, the summary package that Zoe had prepared with the same careful editorial control she brought to everything. Junsuk has been building toward this for how long? At minimum, for years of active preparation. But the ideological groundwork is older. He believes Siwoo's restraint is a structural weakness. That the organization requires a leader who is willing to do things Siwoo won't do. He's not entirely wrong about the restraint, Heian said, in a tone that was not unkind. He is entirely wrong about what it means, Zoe replied. Heian looked at her, then at Siwoo, then back at Zoe. Something passed through her face that was not quite admiration, but was in its family. What is it you need from me specifically? The engagement, Zoe said. I know it was strategic. I'm asking you to consider what strategic value it still holds and what it costs to continue it versus what it costs to modify it. Heian was quiet for a long moment. You're not asking me to withdraw. I'm asking you to think about it clearly, without the social pressure of what withdrawal looks like. The way you'd think about any other political calculation. And your conclusion, if you've already reached one? I think you're too intelligent to attach yourself publicly to an organization that is about to go through a visible internal rupture. Zoe's voice was even. I think your political future is better served by appearing to diverge from Siwoo before the rupture than after it. And I think if you withdraw on terms that read as philosophical rather than personal, you come out of this with a reputation for independence and judgment that is worth more than the alliance would have been. Heian looked at Siwoo. You didn't tell her to say that. No, he said. She's right, Heian said. She looked back at Zoe. She's right, and it's irritating, and I'll need some time to architect the narrative around the withdrawal, but she's right. A pause. What are you getting out of this? Not emotionally. Structurally. Dal doesn't grow up in the shadow of an organization connected to trafficking. Siwoo builds something that isn't built on that. The evidence I have gets used to dismantle Junsuk rather than to burn everything down indiscriminately. Zoe paused. And I've been in survival mode for 3 years. I would very much like to stop. Something changed in the room when she said that. Not dramatically. Zoe was not a woman who allowed things to change dramatically, but it changed. The particular tension of 3 people managing their exposures with precision eased by some small measurable degree. Siwoo looked at her across the table. She was looking at Heian, waiting for a response, but for a fraction of a second she felt his gaze and glanced at him, and in that fraction of a second something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged. Because acknowledging it would have required a conversation they were both too careful to have yet. He had missed her. Not in the uncomplicated way people miss people. He was not built for uncomplicated, but in the specific way that you miss a mind that matched yours. The particular absence of someone who challenged you without performing it, who called your blind spots by their correct names without making it a confrontation. She had spent 3 years building a case and raising their son and preparing for this moment, and she had done it with a quality of execution that he found, even now, even in the midst of everything extraordinary. All right, Heian said. Tell me what you need from my office. The next several weeks were the most operationally complex Siwoo had navigated in years, which was significant because he had navigated some genuinely complex operations. The difference was that this complexity was internal. It was the particular difficulty of dismantling something from inside while the structure was still functioning around you, while the people who maintained it did not yet know what was happening. Junsuk moved against him before Siwoo was ready. Not physically, Junsuk was too intelligent for physical confrontation when organizational leverage was available. He began with information. Leaks, carefully placed, each one slightly differently shaped to create the impression of multiple sources confirming the same conclusion. That Siwoo was emotionally compromised. that a foreign woman had reappeared with a child of uncertain legitimacy, and that Siwoo had lost his characteristic discipline. That the question of succession was open in ways it hadn't been before. The leaks found Siwoo's key relationships and applied pressure at the specific points of maximum sensitivity. A meeting with the Busan shipping partners was suddenly awkward, 3 participants visibly waiting to see which way things would fall before committing to anything. 2 board-level members of the legitimate front enterprise requested information updates that were, in the language of the organization, requests to understand the power situation before choosing sides. Siwoo handled each of these with what appeared, on the surface, to be normalcy. He was system-minded, Zoe had said it herself, and she wasn't wrong. It was the most accurate description of how he functioned, and the system he was most fluent in was the system of organizational trust, which ran not on feeling, but on pattern recognition. People trusted what was consistent. He remained consistent. But at night, in the villa with the ocean view, he thought about Dal. The boy had begun coming on scheduled afternoons, as Zoe had proposed, 2 hours, structured, in the park near the harbor or once at an aquarium where Dal had stood in front of the jellyfish tank for a solid 12 minutes without moving. Watching them with an absorption so complete it had made Siwoo want to laugh, and he had laughed, a real one, quiet, and Dal had looked at him sideways and said, "They don't have brains," in a tone of complete scientific satisfaction. "I know," Siwoo had said. "Does that bother you?" "No," Dal said. "It means they can't be scared." And he had gone back to watching them. Siwoo had thought about that for days afterward. It means they can't be scared. He wondered where that had come from, whether it was something Zoe had said to him once in some context, or whether it was original. Produced by that small, serious mind that had apparently been assembling a philosophy of the world since before it could reliably pronounce certain consonants. He wanted to know him. He wanted, and this was a one he had no framework for managing, because it was not strategic, was not useful, was not anything except human and overwhelming. He wanted to have been there. For the first words and the first steps and the jellyfish phase, and whatever phase had preceded it and whatever phase would follow. He had not been there because Zoe had made a calculated decision that the safest place for Dal was far from Siwoo's world, and she had not been wrong. Given what she knew, given what she had discovered, she had not been wrong. That did not make the absence less. He called her one evening, not for operational updates, just, and this was unusual enough that she paused for a long moment before answering, to ask how Dal had started talking. What? When did he start talking? Was it early or... Siwoo. Her voice was careful. "I missed it," he said. "I'm not asking you to apologize for that. I'm not, I understand why things happened as they did. I'm asking because I want to know." A pause. "You know things about him that I don't know. I would like to know some of them." Silence on the line. Long enough that he thought she might end the call. Then she started talking. She told him about the first word, which had been not mama or anything approximate, but an attempt at the Korean word for light, and jangi, which he had apparently deployed at a lamp on a rainy afternoon with the certainty of a child who had discovered how naming worked and intended to name everything immediately. She told him about the phase where Dal had refused to eat anything orange, which had lasted 4 months, and had included an incident with carrots that she described with a flatness that barely concealed what he could tell, even through the phone, was genuine retrospective exasperation. She talked for 40 minutes. Siwoo sat in the dark villa with his coffee going cold and listened to every word. When she stopped, there was a silence that was different from the operational silences, from the strategic pauses. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make me regret it," she said, but the words didn't have the edge they might have carried a month earlier. He was still thinking about the conversation at 10 the following morning when his phone showed 3 simultaneous messages from 3 separate contacts, each containing variations of the same information. Junsuk had called an emergency organizational assembly for the following week, framed as a routine operational review. The framing was thin. The move was obvious. He was going to present Siwoo's recent behavior as evidence of compromised leadership and propose a formal restructuring of authority, not a coup in the dramatic sense, but a bureaucratic one. The kind that hollowed out power while leaving the title intact as a fig leaf. Siwoo called Zoe. He's moving, he said. I know. She had already heard. How far along is your side of the dismantling? He told her. The financial documentation was almost complete. 3 of the 7 connected channels had already been quietly severed in ways that left no obvious fingerprints. The legal counsel he had retained, from completely outside the organization's normal sphere, was prepared. 2 of the board members who had seemed undecided had, in the last week, quietly signaled through back channels that they were watching and were not yet committed to Jun-suk's version of events. It's not enough, she said. No, he agreed. Not by next week. Then don't wait for it to be enough. She said it cleanly, without drama. Do it now. Publicly. Make the first move before he makes his. I'll lose the Honam revenue entirely. Yes. The Busan partners will pull back. Yes. It will cost. I know what it will cost. Her voice was steady. I've run the numbers. Siwoo, listen to me. Jun-suk's calculation is that you will protect structure over principle because that is what you have always done. Because the system comes first. Because the organization is the thing you have built and you will not burn part of it to save the rest. She paused. He's betting your entire history against you. Is he right? The question sat in the air. Siwoo thought about the jellyfish. It means they can't be scared. No, he said. He's not right. Then move. He moved. The public dismantling was not a press conference. It was quieter and more devastating than that. It was a sequence of precise actions taken through legitimate channels, each one a door closing, each one documented in ways that made the documentation the point. The branch tied to the trafficking intermediaries was formally dissolved through the legal front enterprise, with filings that named the violation explicitly and placed the decision as a voluntary disclosure. Jun-suk's financial channels within the organization were frozen before he could mobilize them. The 2 undecided board members received, simultaneously, a package of evidence, Zoe's 3 years of work, formatted by a lawyer who specialized in making things impossible to dismiss, and a direct phone call from Siwoo that lasted 18 minutes each. Both board members voted with Siwoo before the end of the day. Jun-suk arrived at the organizational assembly to find that the assembly had been restructured into a formal review of his conduct. He had miscalculated in the way that people who mistake fear for power always eventually miscalculate. He had believed that his opponents would hesitate, that the weight of what they stood to lose would make them slow. He had not accounted for the possibility that Siwoo had already decided what he was willing to lose, and that Zoe had been preparing the evidence for 3 years, and that Haein, who had withdrawn from the engagement the previous week in a statement that emphasized philosophical divergence and spoke admiringly about Siwoo's ongoing commitment to organizational reform in terms that were both genuine and strategically perfect, had used her political connections to ensure that the right people were paying attention at the right moment. He had not accounted for 3 people, none of whom were naive, none of whom had done this out of sentiment, all of whom had arrived at the same decision through different routes. Jun-suk sat in the assembly room and understood, in the specific way that intelligent people understand things when the moment of understanding is too late to be useful, that he had lost. Not to emotion. Not to personal loyalty. Not to the kind of irrationality he had spent years counting on Siwoo's caution to prevent. He had lost to a better system. He said, toward the end of the assembly, in a tone that carried the particular quality of a man trying to locate his dignity in a room that had stopped containing any, "You're going to burn everything you've built." Some of it, Siwoo said. The parts that should have been burned a long time ago. You'll be weaker. Different, Siwoo said. Not weaker. That's a distinction for people who can afford philosophy. I'm finding I can afford more than I thought, Siwoo said, and moved on. The restructuring took 3 months. The syndicate became, gradually and then in a way that felt almost sudden when it was complete, something that it was not embarrassing to look at directly. The Jeju tourism enterprise was real. It had been a legitimate operation for years, always managed to a standard that could survive scrutiny, and it expanded. The shipping operations were audited, cleaned, restructured under new management that did not include anyone from Jun-suk's faction. Some revenue was lost. Some partners departed. The Busan relationship went cold for 6 weeks and then, unexpectedly, came back warm because it turned out the Busan partners had their own concerns about where things had been heading and were not unhappy to see the change. Hae-in became, over the following months, something that suited her considerably better than fiancé. She became an independent political figure with a reputation for principled divergence, which was exactly as useful in her world as she had calculated it would be. She and Siwoo maintained a professional respect that was entirely genuine. She sent Dal a birthday gift in April that was age-appropriate, well-chosen, and came with a note that said, "Only, grow well." Dal turned 3 at a small gathering on the beach below Siwoo's villa. Zoe had organized it, small, controlled, nothing that required managing. Just a few people she trusted and the sand and the February Jeju wind that was cold enough that Dal spent most of the afternoon bundled into a coat that was too big for him by a miscalculation in sizing that had produced, as these miscalculations sometimes do, an outcome that was accidentally charming. Siwoo stood next to Zoe at the edge of the gathering and watched Dal try to chase a goal that had landed with misplaced confidence near the cake table. "He has your stubbornness," Siwoo said. "He is yours," she said. "I'm patient. You're stubborn. There's a distinction? Ask me again in a year." He looked at her. She was watching Dal with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he had seen from her since she had reappeared, a look that was only love, without any of the management around it, because the child did not require the management. The child was the one thing she did not have to be strategic about. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask. What do you want now?" Not for Dal. Not from the organization. "What do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment, the wind moving the edge of her jacket, the sound of Dal's determined footsteps audible behind them, the goal making its escape with the dignified haste of a creature that has reconsidered its life choices. "To stop running contingencies," she said finally. "To not have to plan for every possible version of how something could go wrong." She paused. "I've been doing that for 3 years. It kept us safe. But I'm tired of it." "You don't have to keep doing it," he said. "I know," she said. "I know I don't have to. I just haven't." She stopped. "Started again. I haven't figured out how to stop yet." "That's all right," he said. "We have time." She looked at him. Something in her face moved toward the thing that had been there before all of this, before the disappearance and the 3 years and the evidence gathering and the tactical return, something that was not yet what it had been, but was the outline of it, the shape that could. Given time and honesty and the particular daily work of rebuilding what had been broken, become something again. "Don't rush me," she said. "I won't," he said. Dal reappeared beside them, breathless, the too big coat askew, looking up at Siwoo with those gray-blue eyes that were going to be, Siwoo understood, the most consistently disarming thing in his daily life for the foreseeable future. "The bird left," Dal announced. "They do that," Siwoo said. "Will it come back?" "Probably," Siwoo said. "They usually do." Dal considered this with the gravity appropriate to the information, decided it was satisfactory, and went back to the cake table with the focused purposefulness of a child who had concluded that cake was more reliable than goals, which was not incorrect. Weeks later, in a quiet afternoon that was not marked by anything in particular, no assembly, no evidence package, no strategic meeting, Dal was sitting in Siwoo's study with a book about ocean animals that he was working through with methodical satisfaction, and he looked up without preamble and said, "Are you the boss?" Siwoo looked at him, thought about what the question actually contained, how much weight a 3-year-old could accidentally place on 4 words without knowing it. "Not like before," he said. Dal looked at him for a moment. "What are you like now?" "Still figuring it out," Siwoo said. Dal nodded, apparently satisfied that this was an acceptable work in progress, and went back to the ocean animals. Siwoo sat across from him in the quiet of the afternoon and felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, that the answer was true and that being in the middle of it, not at the end, not with everything resolved, but in the actual middle of becoming something different, was not a failure of completion. It was the work itself. Legacy is not inherited. It is chosen, day by day, in the decisions that cost something real, in the systems you are willing to rebuild from the floor. in the willingness to be known by a small, serious child who watches jellyfish and chases gulls and asks questions you were not prepared to answer honestly until now. The ocean outside the window was the same ocean it had always been. The island held its ground. And in the study of a man who was learning, at significant expense and with considerable difficulty, what it meant to lead something worth leading, a boy turned a page and read about things that lived in the deep water and did not require armor to survive. If this story kept you thinking, you're exactly who we made it for. Subscribe for more stories that don't take the easy road. Drop a comment telling us which character hit hardest. And if someone you know needs to hear a story about choosing what you become, share this. The algorithm rewards it, and so do we.